US President Donald Trump has labelled Vladimir Zelensky a dictator. It comes after the US and Russia held high-stakes talks in Saudi Arabia to lay the groundwork as they try to bring the three-year war in Ukraine to an end, a war that has left around 1 million people dead. This is what Donald Trump had to say.
Today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal for Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, almost all of the land, and no people would have been killed, and no city would have been demolished, and not one dome would have been knocked down.
Joining us is Joe Siracusa, Dean of Global Futures at Curtin University. Joe, thank you so much for joining us. The world has to welcome the fact that there are now serious talks in place to bring this war to an end. But what do you make of the language we are hearing from Donald Trump now, calling Zelensky a dictator and also saying that Ukraine started the war?
Good morning. Actually, I'm quite pleased that the president has actually said this. Now, he tends to use hyperbole a little bit, tends to exaggerate. A lot of people do, but what he really means is that Zelensky is not going to have an election before this negotiations begin, and both Putin and Trump have reminded Zelensky that there hasn't been an election during the military conflict there, and that there should be one to show whether he represents people or not. And so Trump's saying, look, if you don't want to have an election, you're a dictator. And I want your audience to remember this too. And I've been waiting for this to bubble up. You keep in mind that first impeachment all began when some former Ukrainian national who'd become an American citizen, was now a colonel, released that phone conversation Donald Trump had with Zelensky back in the day, I think for about, I don't know, $50 million or something. President wanted Zelensky to investigate the Biden family corruption scandal in Ukraine. And, these guys go way back. And I'm sure Trump's been waiting to zing it to this guy for a long time. Now, President Zelensky said that Trump lives in this world of disinformation, which is sort of shorthand for, he's stupid. The New York Times used to call Ronald Reagan and George W. Bush incurious. And so he really had a go at him. And of course, Trump isn't going to settle for that. So he let him have it. And yes, these negotiations are going on. Donald Trump has by himself effected a revolution in American diplomacy. Putin is in, Zelensky is out. The Europeans are out. They've been relegated. NATO has been dying for a while. It's 76 years old, by the way, and it's had no relevance since 1991. And President Trump is correct in saying that this war could have been avoided. I was jumping up and down 3 years ago, reminding people that we were in a similar situation during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Nikita Khrushchev tried to bring intermediate-range ballistic missiles into Cuba, only 90 miles from Florida, which would shorten the time of a nuclear attack there. Same thing here. And all President Biden had to do 3 years ago was just to pick up the phone and tell Putin that NATO was not going into Ukraine and there'd be no advanced weapons systems in their border during his watch. So what did Biden do? He didn't pick up the phone for 3 years, and he backed Zelensky to the hilt. And Ukraine's a complicated place. Gabriella, it's got 17% of the population is Russian. It was part of the Soviet empire for a long, long time. It had missile sites there and all the rest of it. And so, but this could have been handled at the top. And your audience ought to keep in mind something else. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, which lasted 13 days, nobody asked Cuba what they wanted to do. Nikita Khrushchev and John Kennedy negotiated the entire time, one way or the other. So this idea that they're being left out in the cold, that's not new, as a matter of fact.
US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has stressed that this summit is just the beginning of a wider conversation that will involve Ukraine and the European Union. This is what he's had to say.
In order to bring an end to any conflict, there has to be concessions made by all sides. We're not going to predetermine what those are. Certainly not going to negotiate this today or in a press conference for that matter. But, and there are other parties that have sanctions. The European Union is going to have to be at the table at some point because they have sanctions as well that have been imposed.
Joe, I really want your thoughts on what some of the factors are that need to be considered when these peace talks are taking place. I suppose we need to work out when the war is going to end. Ukraine can't join NATO. What other security guarantees can Ukraine receive? There's also the discussion around territory, lifting economic sanctions. There's a lot to cover here.
Yes, there is. Now, look, these negotiations in Riyadh between the Americans and the Russians have two purposes. Number one, it's to reset the Russian-American relations, which have been on hold for 3 years. It's a very dangerous relationship to set aside because, next to China-U.S. relations, it's the second most important relationship on the planet, and they both are armed with nuclear weapons, up to their eyeballs. So, it's an important security relationship. So it was a reset button. And, the Russians said you can come back with your oil companies, and they want the sanctions lifted and all the rest of it. The second part of this, and this is what the the second part is about Ukraine. And what the Americans want and what the Russians are agreeing to is an unconditional ceasefire followed by diplomatic negotiations. Now, I don't care. No one cares if the negotiations go on for 10 years in some hotel in Geneva, like a lot of times this happens. But what Trump wants is he wants a ceasefire and diplomatic negotiations. And he's made it very clear to the Ukrainians, if they don't take part in these negotiations, then, they're not going to get anything else. They've received over, $100 billion from the American taxpayer. And, they've been very brave people. They've taken on the former Soviet Union, and they've acquitted themselves heroically. But this loss of life is not only tragic, but it was unnecessary. I mean, we didn't have to go this far. That's what the president's trying to say. And the president is not only, spiting Joe Biden here. The President Trump is wiping the floor with the American foreign policy elite. It's been, picking a fight with Russia now for the past 50 years. Same thing with China. He's not buying the story that Russia is one of the most dangerous nations on earth. He sees Russia as an integral part of Europe. He sees Putin as a major player in great power politics. And there's an awful lot about President Trump that likes the World War II alliance between Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. He likes the idea that he can move in these circles. And, as a realist myself, I think he's on the right track.
How can peace be maintained?
Well, there's going to be some kind of negotiation at the end of the day. The Ukrainians will have to sign. The Europeans will be off to the sidelines. They're not going to sign anything, actually. And it's going to go like this. President Putin is going to get Crimea, which he took in 2014. And he is going to get the Donetsk area, where we have a large population of Russians. Most of Western Ukraine will be in Ukraine's hands, et cetera. And I think it's going to look pretty much what Zelensky could have had when he was negotiating briefly in February 2022 or in early March in Russia or in Turkey. So it's going to have sort of a presence there of some international troops. Now, Putin's made it very clear he doesn't want any NATO troops in the area. And let me tell you, the Ukrainians don't want any Germans there. The French aren't about to volunteer. The Hungarians aren't going. The Austrians aren't going. And as a matter of fact, the only nation with their hand up is Britain. And this is where Brexit has a very sour taste. NATO members, European Union members, remember that when Britain checked out of Brexit, it showed a great deal of disloyalty. And NATO nations don't trust Britain, as a matter of fact. They lost all their credibility when they took that hike. So, but anyway, we're going to have international troops, and do not be surprised to see maybe some United Nations presence there. do not be surprised to see some Chinese troops there, keep people from killing each other, and that kind of thing. There might even be some American troops. But we're not going to have NATO there. I mean, Putin won't tolerate NATO on the premises. So we're going to have a relatively stable period. But, you know, who's going to open their checkbook to rebuild the place? You know, it's many parts of Ukraine, as President Trump says, have been reduced to rubble. So we get the same thing there as we do in Gaza. I mean, who's going to pay for the mess? And there's a great deal of mess to be taken care of.